Chapter 3. A few seconds, none of the Hardys spoke. They were trying to decide if the caller at the kitchen door really was a radio ham with a message or perhaps a member of the burglary gang. Finally, Miss Hardy said,
"We can't let the man stand out there in the rain."
Frank called out, "Where's the message from?"
"Mr. Hardy in San Francisco."
"Open the door,"
Miss Hardy said quietly. Joe hid the box containing the invention, and then he and Joe stood on either side of the door, poised for any attack. Aunt Gertrude was armed herself and with a broom. Joe turned the knob, and a water-drenched figure in a raincoat and hat stepped into the kitchen.
"Thanks,"
the man said, removing his hat.
"What a night. My wife told me I was crazy to come out here."
The speaker was an honest-faced man of about 35. He noticed Aunt Gertrude's broom and smiled.
"Well, you can put that away. I'm harmless."
Miss Hardy looked embarrassed.
"Take off your coat. I'll get you some coffee."
The man nodded.
"Well, I could use it. I got cold walking over here. My car wouldn't start."
"Well, how far'd you come?" Joe asked.
"Oh, about 5 blocks. I'm Larry Burton of 69 Meadowbrook Road. I've always wanted to meet the Hardy boys. This all came about in sort of a funny way. I have a short set-wave radio, and tonight I picked up your father. He said he couldn't get through to you or the police or on the phone. The lines were all tied up, and you didn't answer his signal on your shortwave set."
"Well, we weren't really expecting a call," Frank answered. He did not say that the boys had not been home and that their mother and Aunt Gertrude rarely paid attention to the set, unless specifically asked to do so.
"Well, by the time I phoned you, the lightning was getting pretty fierce," Burton went on. "My wife's scared to death of lightning. She wouldn't let me use the phone, so I just walked over."
Aunt Gertrude served the caller some coffee and cake as they sat around the big kitchen table. "What was the message, Mr. Burton?" Joe asked.
"Well, that you boys are in great danger. A gang's after you. Will stop at nothing to get what they want."
"Oh, how dreadful! Did my husband name this gang?"
Miss Hardy exclaimed.
"No, that's all there was to the message," Burton replied. "I'm sorry to bring you bad news, but I guess that's to be expected in a detective's family. Well, I must be getting along."
He stood up. Frank shook the man's hand. "We sure appreciate this. Maybe sometime we can return the favor."
"Oh, forget it. I only hope that gang don't hurt you fellas."
Joe helped him with his coat, and he went out. The storm had moved off. For a few minutes the Hardys discussed the caller and confirmed his address in the telephone dictionary. Joe was a bit skeptical, however. He either made up that whole story or either Dad really is concerned for our safety. Frank was inclined to think that Burton had told the truth. Had he and Joe already encountered 2 members of the gang at the Wright house? Aunt Gertrude spoke up.
"How in the world did my brother Fenton hear this in California?" "Oh, news travels, especially among detectives and the police."
Aunt Gertrude muttered, and then announced that she was off to bed. 10 minutes later, Frank and Joe were asleep and did not awaken until 10 o'clock. At once, Frank got up and opened a wooden chest of sport equipment under which he had hidden the box containing Mr. Wright's invention. It was still there. Where do you think we should keep this?" he asked Joe as they were dressing. "Dad said not to leave the box at home." "Well, it's a tough problem, Frank. With that gang after us, we can't take the chance of carrying it around with us." "Right, but they may not be after us, but after the invention," Frank answered. While they were having breakfast, Frank came up with the idea of a unique hiding place for the invention. Let's put it in the well under the spare tire in the trunk of our car, he said. Joe laughed. Now you're using that old brain of yours. That's probably the best place you could have picked. The car vibrations won't hurt the radio, and no one would ever think of looking under there. Miss Hardy asked her boys what their plans were for the day. Well, Dad told us to drop into the antique airplane show and see if we could spot anyone who might be seemingly overly interested, Frank replied. He thought the person who stole Mr. Wright's old plane might be planning for another theft. And tonight, Joe continued, we're going to go to Chet's party and stay until tomorrow. Is that all right?
Oh, of course,
his mother answered. Chet Morton, an overweight, good-natured schoolmate, lived up on a farm on the edge of Bayport. A group of boys and girls had been invited there to a barn dance and a late supper. Frank and Joe would pick up Callie Shaw, a special friend of Frank's. His brother's date was usually Chet's sister Isla. Miss Hardy remarked that since the boys would be away, that she'd spend the night with a friend.
You're at plans to visit Cousin Helen in Graceham anyway.
During the conversation, Aunt Gertrude had left the table. She returned holding the local morning newspaper.
Well, you boys are in for some real trouble. Listen to this.
Miss Hardy read an account of the captured burglars at the Wright home in the mysterious summons to the police. The item stressed the fact that the man's assailants, when caught, should be dealt with severely. When caught, huh? Joe burst out laughing. We're going to be pretty hard to find, aren't we, Frank? His brother grinned, but Miss Hardy looked worried.
Maybe you boys should explain everything to Chief Colig.
Oh, not without Dad and Mr. Wright's permission, Frank answered. For the time being.
I haven't finished,
Aunt Gertrude interrupted.
It says here that the police think this incident might be part of a gang feud.
She removed her reading glasses and gazed at her nephew.
You two are now considered to be part of a gang, and the rival gang is about to harm you.
Gracious, said Joe, pulling his hair down over his eyes and striking the pose of a belligerent bad guy. Well, we best be looking the part. Since the antique airplane show did not open until 2 o'clock, the boys did various chores till morning. They also hid Mr. Wright's invention in the tire well and bolted the spare back into place. After lunch, Frank and Joe drove Aunt Gertrude to the train. From there, they went directly to the Bayport Air Terminal, where the antique airplane exhibit was housed in a spacious lobby. And the first person they saw was Chet Morton. "Hey, fellas!" he greeted them. "Say, take a look at them old planes. Ain't they beauties?" "Sure are," Frank agreed. "I noticed that most of them are biplanes. It must have been fun flying in the days of those open cockpits." "You can say that again," Chet declared. As he stepped back for a better view, his foot slammed down on the toe of a man that was standing directly behind him. "Ow!" the stranger yelped. The boys turned to see the man hopping around on one foot. "You stupid, overgrown kid!" he screamed. "I'm awfully sorry," Chet said apologetically. The tall, muscular man, who had blond hair and hard features, looked at the youth malevolently. "You idiot!" he snarled. Frank and Joe stepped in front of Chet as he stammered, Who are you calling an idiot?" "Now, just a minute," Joe interrupted. "It was an accident. There's no sense getting upset about this." "Can I be of any help?" the boys heard someone saying. They looked around to see a lanky young man walking towards them. He had rust-colored hair and leathery skin that was deeply tan. "What are you butting in for?" snapped the stranger. "This boy didn't step on you intentionally," the young man insisted. "I saw the whole thing. You were trying to listen to their conversation and got a little bit too close." The tall stranger was about to say something but hesitated. For a moment, he glared at Chet and his companions, then stopped off to the lobby, swinging his briefcase. Frank and Joe looked at each other. Why had the man been listening to their conversation? Did he belong to the gang that had been warned about? Meanwhile, Chet was saying, "Well, thanks for all your help, mister." "My name is Cole Weber," the young man introduced himself. "I'm president of the Central Antique Airplane Club. We own the exhibit and are taking in several airports. We're trying to encourage public interest in vintage airplanes." "Sure sounds like a great club," Joe remarked. "We think so too," Weber agreed. "The majority of the models you see here are replicas of real airplanes owned and operated by our members." "You mean that some of those old crates, they can still fly?" Chet asked. Weber grinned. "Well, we don't think of them as crates. When properly rebuilt, most antique planes are as safe and reliable as the day they were originally made. I own one myself. It's outside on the ramp. Would you care to see it?" "Would we ever!" Joe exclaimed. Mr. Weber led the boys to the airport ramp. A short distance ahead stood an orange and white biplane. The boys peered into the two open cockpits. "Gosh, this sure is cool," Joe declared. The pilot smiled. "Well, compared to the modern planes, mine doesn't have quite as many instruments, but since we fly the antiques only for fun, we don't need elaborate equipment such as that required for all-weather operations." The boys looked closely at the diagonal patterns of wires that stretched betwixt the wings. Then they examined the plane's radial engine and the long, slender wooden propeller. "How many passengers can you carry?" Frank asked. "Well, you can carry 2 up in the front cockpit," Weber answered. "Hey, would you 2 like to go for a ride?" The boys' eyes widened in excitement. Then Frank and Joe remembered the sleuthing that they had promised their father. "Well, thanks just the same," Frank said, "but I'm afraid Joe and we can't go at this time." "Well, I sure would like to, though," Chet spoke up. "Say, fellas, could you drive me to the farm afterwards?" "Farm?" Weber interrupted. "Are there any level stretches of ground in the area?" "Oh, there's plenty of them. Why?" "Well, I could fly you home if you'd like." Chet was tingling with excitement. "Hey, that's great. Thanks, man." The flyer opened the baggage compartment and took out a parachute, helmet, and goggles. "Well, put these on and climb up into the front cockpit." "Hey, Mr. Weber, do you know Malcolm Wright?" Frank asked. "Well, yes, indeed. He is a member of our club." "Did you hear that his antique plane was stolen?" Joe put in. Weber nodded. "Yeah, it's too bad. I understand he had some secret invention that he was trying out in the plane. I hope that wasn't stolen, too." The boys caught their breath in astonishment, but said nothing. They hadn't heard this. Weber didn't seem to notice. He put on his own parachute and then summoned a mechanic to twirl the propeller and start the engine. Then he climbed into the rear cockpit. "Brakes off! Switch off!" the mechanic called out. "Brakes on, switch off!" Weber echoed. The mechanic pulled the propeller through several times, and then he stepped back and yelled, "Contact! Contact!" The pilot responded. The engine caught on the first try. A staccato of popping developed into a steady roar. Chet's goggled face turned towards the Hardys. He waved wildly as Weber taxied out for a takeoff. "Hey, we'll see you at the party!" Chet hollered out over the roar of the engine. Minutes later, the plane, looking like a box kite, was climbing above the Bayport field. As the Hardys turned to leave, Frank caught his brother's arm. "Hey, there's that man that Chet stepped on. He's watching us from the doorway. And this time, I intend to find out why. Frank started to run. Come on, Joe. End of chapter 3.